It was an ordinary afternoon for Michael, a seasoned paramedic, and his partner Sarah. They were on their usual route, responding to an emergency call in the heart of the city. The call had come in as a car accident involving multiple vehicles. Michael and Sarah hurried to the scene, the sirens blaring as they navigated through traffic. The streets were crowded with people, all trying to get to their destinations, unaware of the urgency of their mission. When they arrived at the accident, they immediately began assessing the situation. 2 people were trapped in the wreckage, and they needed to act fast. Sarah and Michael worked efficiently, talking to the victims and preparing them for transport to the hospital. The situation was tense, but both paramedics were calm and focused. They managed to extract the victims from the wreckage and get them into the ambulance. As Michael and Sarah started to drive the ambulance towards the hospital, the traffic ahead of them slowed to a crawl. Michael glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. The injured people in the back needed urgent medical attention, and every second counted. The city's traffic was notorious for getting in the way of emergency vehicles, and today was no different. That's when they encountered Officer Thompson. He stood in the middle of the road, blocking their path. His hand was raised in a stop motion, and his stern face showed no signs of moving. Michael's heart sank as he slowed the ambulance to a stop. Sarah leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she watched the officer. "Officer, we have 2 patients in critical condition," Michael called out, his voice calm, but with a sense of urgency. "We need to get them to the hospital as quickly as possible." The officer didn't move. Instead, he narrowed his eyes at Michael and Sarah, his gaze filled with suspicion. "I don't care who you're carrying in that ambulance. You'll have to wait until the traffic clears," Officer Thompson said sharply, crossing his arms. Sarah was taken aback. "Sir, we're in an emergency situation," she protested. "These people need medical attention now." But Officer Thompson didn't seem to care. His face remained unchanged as he continued to block their way. Michael could feel the frustration building inside him. He had been a paramedic for over a decade, but this was the first time he had ever encountered such resistance from a police officer in the middle of an emergency. "Move out of the way," Michael snapped, his patience thinning. He knew he had to stay calm, but the pressure of the situation was getting to him. The officer's behavior didn't make sense. The traffic wasn't moving, and now he was preventing them from getting to the hospital. Sarah spoke again, trying to reason with Officer Thompson. "We don't have time for this. People's lives are at risk." Officer Thompson, however, wasn't having it. "I said no. You'll have to wait," he replied, his tone growing more hostile. Michael could see the officer's deep-rooted frustration, but it wasn't the time for this. Lives were on the line. Feeling helpless, Michael stepped out of the ambulance. "You're blocking a life-saving vehicle. I need you to move now," he demanded, stepping closer to the officer. The officer's gaze hardened. "Step back, paramedic. I'm in charge here." Michael's heart raced as the situation escalated. He had dealt with tough situations before, but nothing like this. It was clear that Officer Thompson was more interested in asserting his authority than helping in any way. The seconds felt like hours, and every minute that passed made Michael more anxious. The lives of his patients depended on him getting them to the hospital quickly, but Officer Thompson was standing in their way. As the standoff continued, Michael glanced nervously at the ambulance's rearview mirror. His patients were in critical condition. Time was running out. And still, the officer refused to budge. The pressure was building, and Michael could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. He had never been in a situation where his ability to help was being hindered by something as senseless as this. His hands clenched into fists, and he took a deep breath. What could he do? He had to think fast. Every moment mattered. The air between Michael and Officer Thompson was thick with tension. Michael, feeling the pressure mounting, knew he had to act quickly. His instincts told him he couldn't let this delay last any longer. His patients' lives depended on him getting them to the hospital, and Officer Thompson's refusal to clear the way was putting everything in jeopardy. "Officer, please, we're trying to save lives here," Michael said again, trying to keep his voice steady. His words were calm, but the urgency in them was clear. He looked back toward the ambulance, where the patients were in critical condition. Time was running out. Officer Thompson's expression remained stoic. He stood with his arms crossed, eyes locked on Michael. He wasn't moving. Sarah, who had remained in the ambulance, could feel the pressure too. She could hear Michael talking to the officer, but it was clear they weren't getting anywhere. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever. Michael took a step forward, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Look, we're not trying to make trouble," he said. "We're doing our job, and that's saving lives. Please move so we can get through." But Officer Thompson didn't respond right away. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. Michael could hear the distant sound of cars honking and the steady rush of people in the city. It felt like the whole world was moving on, and they were stuck in a standoff. Just then, Michael saw a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. He turned his head and noticed a familiar figure approaching from behind the officer. Detective Marcus Green, an old friend of Michael's from the department. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. Marcus was known for his fair approach, and he knew that if anyone could get through to Officer Thompson, it would be him. "Marcus," Michael called out, his voice carrying the weight of the situation. "Thank God you're here. We need to get through. These people need help." Detective Green, a tall man with a calm demeanor, walked up to Officer Thompson, who now seemed distracted by the arrival of his colleague. Green placed a hand on the officer's shoulder and gave him a look, one that told him to step aside. "Thompson, what's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice low and steady. "This is an emergency. Let them through." Officer Thompson hesitated. He didn't like being overruled in front of others, especially not by someone like Marcus. He was a by-the-book officer, and he had always prided himself on following protocol. But Marcus's commanding presence and the urgency in Michael's voice finally made him step back. Slowly, he moved aside, allowing Michael and Sarah to pass. Michael's heart raced as he quickly jumped back into the driver's seat. He didn't waste a second. The moment he started the engine, the ambulance roared back to life, and they sped down the street, heading straight for the hospital. The road ahead seemed clear now, but the tension still lingered in Michael's chest. The delay had cost them precious time. "Thank you, Marcus," Michael said, his voice full of gratitude. "You don't know what that means right now." Marcus gave a small nod, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "Just doing my job," he replied. "Let's get those people to safety." Sarah, who had been anxiously waiting in the back, glanced over at Michael. "We've still got this," she said, trying to reassure him. Michael took a deep breath. He knew they had to keep pushing forward. They were on the edge, but they could still make it. He gripped the steering wheel with renewed determination. As the ambulance raced through the streets, he couldn't shake the memory of Officer Thompson's cold stare. It reminded him of how, sometimes, even the smallest of obstacles could stand in the way of doing what was right. They were now almost at the hospital, but Michael knew the hardest part of the day wasn't over yet. He would have to face the consequences of what had happened on the street. What would happen next? Would Officer Thompson apologize, or would this escalate further? But for now, his only focus was getting his patients the help they needed. The sirens blared once more, cutting through the noise of the busy city as they made their way to the hospital. As the ambulance raced down the street, Michael couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in his stomach. The incident with Officer Thompson had thrown him off balance. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. The officer's refusal to let them through had delayed their mission, and in this line of work, every second counted. They were lucky to have Detective Marcus Green arrive when he did. The hospital was just a few blocks away now, and Michael focused all his energy on getting there as quickly as possible. The sirens wailed, cutting through the quiet streets as the flashing lights illuminated the pavement. It was a scene Michael had grown used to, the urgency of it all, the adrenaline, the responsibility of saving lives. But today, something felt different. The weight of the earlier conflict was still heavy on his mind. Sarah, who had been assisting the patients in the back of the ambulance, glanced up at Michael. She could see the strain on his face. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft yet concerned. Michael nodded, but he didn't say anything. His thoughts were racing. The anger from the confrontation with Officer Thompson had settled, but now he was left with the uncertainty of what would happen next. He had done his job. He had saved lives. But would the officer's actions go unnoticed? Would there be consequences for the delay? And most importantly, why had Officer Thompson reacted the way he did? They were almost at the hospital now. Michael turned onto the familiar street, his mind still reeling. As they pulled into the parking area of the emergency entrance, a sense of relief washed over him. They had made it, and that was the most important thing. He parked the ambulance, and before he even turned off the engine, Sarah was already jumping out to assist the medical team waiting to receive the patients. "Come on," Michael said, following her. He didn't need to tell her. They were both fully aware of the urgency. They needed to get the patients into the ER fast. As they moved toward the entrance, Michael noticed Detective Marcus Green standing near the door, waiting for them. He gave them a small nod, signaling that everything was under control. But even with the comforting presence of Marcus, Michael's mind kept going back to Officer Thompson. It wasn't just the officer's actions that bothered him. It was the thought of what could have happened if Marcus hadn't arrived in time. What if the situation had escalated further? Michael had seen firsthand how a single confrontation could spiral out of control. And the fact that it was happening with someone who was supposed to be helping, someone who was supposed to be there for the community, made it all the more difficult to process. While Sarah and the hospital staff quickly took over with the patients, Michael stepped aside for a moment, trying to calm his thoughts. He took a deep breath, willing himself to focus on what mattered most, the lives he had just saved. He knew that Officer Thompson had acted out of turn, but now was not the time to dwell on it. The patients were the priority. Just as Michael was about to head back inside, he saw Officer Thompson walking into the hospital lobby, his face tense. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would the officer approach him with an apology? Would there be a confrontation? His thoughts raced. But as the officer walked past him, something surprising happened. Officer Thompson stopped, his face still unreadable. Then, quietly, he spoke. "I'm sorry about what happened," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I overreacted back there. I should have cleared the way for you." Michael was taken aback by the apology. He wasn't expecting it, but at that moment, he realized that the officer was acknowledging his mistake. Michael nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you," Michael replied, his voice steady. "I know this job is hard, but we all have a responsibility to do what's right." Officer Thompson gave a small nod of his own before turning away. Michael watched him leave, feeling a mix of emotions. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had led to an unexpected resolution. In that moment, Michael knew that sometimes the best way to move forward was to acknowledge the mistakes and learn from them. As Michael turned to join the team, he realized that, despite the challenges, they had done what they came to do, save lives. And that was what mattered most. The sun had already set, and the city was quieter than it had been during the day. The lights from the ambulance still flickered faintly as it sat in the parking lot, its sirens now silent. Inside the hospital, things had calmed down as well, but for Michael, the day was far from over. After handing off the patients to the medical team, he found himself sitting alone in a small break room, his mind still processing everything that had happened. He leaned back in his chair, running his hands over his face. The events earlier with Officer Thompson still haunted him. It wasn't just the officer's actions that bothered him, but the fact that it had come to this point. He had seen things like this before, but never so close to home. The anger, the injustice, it all felt too familiar, too personal. Michael couldn't help but replay the scene in his mind. The officer's refusal to let them pass, the frustration building up inside him. And finally, the explosion of tension. He had been there before, in countless high-pressure situations, but this one felt different. The officer wasn't just another person standing in the way. He was a part of a system that was supposed to protect everyone. And when that system failed, it wasn't just the individuals who suffered, it was everyone. Just then, there was a soft knock on the door, pulling Michael out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Detective Marcus Green standing in the doorway, his expression calm but serious. "Can I come in?" Marcus asked. Michael nodded, gesturing for him to take a seat. The two of them had worked together many times before, but this was the first time Michael had seen Marcus in such a somber mood. "I wanted to check on you," Marcus said as he sat down. "How are you doing after everything?" Michael took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. "I'm fine. Just processing it all." "I get it," Marcus replied. "That situation could have gone a lot differently. I'm just glad we got the patients to the hospital safely." Michael looked at him, grateful for his words. He had been trying to focus on the positive, on the fact that they had saved lives. But the events with Officer Thompson still weighed on him. "I appreciate you stepping in today," Michael said. "You didn't have to do that." Marcus shook his head. "We're all in this together. You know that. But I'll be honest with you, Michael, I've seen the way people react to this job, the way it can change them. I don't want that to happen to you." Michael leaned forward, his hands resting on the table in front of him. "I don't know what happened today. That officer, I'm just trying to understand why he acted the way he did. I've been doing this job for years, and I've never encountered something like that." Marcus nodded, understanding. "It's tough. But sometimes, people are just looking for someone to take the frustration out on. It's not right, but it happens." Michael sat back in his chair, thinking about what Marcus had said. It wasn't an excuse for the officer's actions, but it helped explain why people sometimes acted out of frustration. It didn't make what happened right, but it made it easier to understand. The silence between them was comfortable, and for a few moments, neither of them spoke. It wasn't until the door to the break room opened again that either of them moved. A nurse walked in with a small clipboard, looking at Michael. "We need you back in the ER for a moment. A few things came up with one of the patients you helped earlier." Michael stood up, his mind already shifting back to the task at hand. "Got it. I'll be right there." Before leaving, Michael turned back to Marcus. "Thanks again for everything." Marcus smiled and gave a small nod. "You know where to find me." As Michael left the break room and made his way back to the ER, he felt a little lighter. The events of the day hadn't been easy, but talking with Marcus had helped. The day wasn't over, and there was still work to be done. But for the first time that evening, Michael felt a little more at peace. The job would always have its challenges, but with people like Marcus by his side, he knew he wasn't alone. And that made all the difference. The next few days were a blur for Michael. After the incident with Officer Thompson, things had started to settle down at the hospital, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He kept thinking about the officer's actions, wondering if there was more to it than just a heated argument on the street. His mind replayed the scene over and over again, trying to make sense of it all. Every time he thought about it, the frustration built up again. Officer Thompson had been acting out of line, but Michael couldn't help wondering if there were deeper issues at play. Was the officer just another person feeling the pressures of a job that often required split-second decisions, or was there something more troubling behind his behavior? Despite the lingering confusion, Michael knew he had to move forward. He couldn't let this one incident cloud his ability to do his job. Every day brought new challenges, and the patients needed him. But as much as he tried to focus on his work, the thought of Officer Thompson's behavior kept gnawing at him. One evening, after his shift had ended, Michael found himself standing outside the hospital, breathing in the cool night air. The city around him was quiet, with only the distant hum of traffic. It was peaceful, but his thoughts were anything but calm. As he leaned against the railing, trying to clear his mind, a familiar face appeared. It was Detective Marcus Green, walking up to him with a purposeful stride. Michael straightened up as Marcus approached. "I know it's been a tough few days," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But we need to talk." Michael nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He knew this conversation was coming. Marcus had been the first to reach out to him after the incident, and Michael had a feeling that it was more than just a casual check-in. "What's going on?" Michael asked. Marcus looked around, ensuring no one was nearby, and then lowered his voice. "I've been doing some digging. About Officer Thompson." Michael's interest piqued. He had hoped someone would be looking into it. "What did you find?" Marcus sighed deeply, his expression troubled. "I've been talking to a few people who know him well. Turns out, he's been under a lot of pressure lately. His wife just filed for divorce. His mother's health is deteriorating, and he's been dealing with some personal demons. But here's the thing, none of that justifies what he did." Michael listened intently, absorbing what Marcus was saying. It made sense that the officer might be struggling with personal issues, but it still didn't excuse his actions. "That still doesn't explain why he acted the way he did with me," Michael said, his voice tight with frustration. "I get that he's going through a lot, but that doesn't give him the right to take it out on me or anyone else." Marcus nodded in agreement. "I'm not defending him. What he did was wrong, and he needs to face consequences for it. But sometimes it helps to understand the bigger picture. People act out when they're overwhelmed, and it can cloud their judgment." Michael rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation. "I get that, but it still doesn't sit right with me. I was just trying to do my job and keep people safe." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a comforting gesture. "I know, Michael, and you did. You handled the situation as best as you could. Now, the important thing is to let things play out the way they should. The truth will come to light." Michael sighed, feeling the tension in his chest slowly ease. It wasn't easy to let go of the anger he felt toward Officer Thompson, but Marcus was right. He couldn't let this one incident define his work or his view of law enforcement as a whole. "Thanks for letting me know," Michael said, his voice calmer now. "I appreciate you looking into it." Marcus smiled slightly, giving him an understanding nod. "Anytime. You're not alone in this, Michael. We're in it together." As Marcus turned to walk away, Michael watched him disappear into the night. He felt a little lighter, a little more at peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with people like Marcus by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. The truth would always come to the surface, and that gave him hope. The days following the conversation with Detective Marcus Green were filled with mixed emotions for Michael. On one hand, he was relieved to have some clarity about Officer Thompson's personal struggles, but on the other hand, he couldn't shake the image of the officer's actions. It was difficult for him to understand how someone who wore the same uniform could behave in such a way, especially towards a fellow human being who was simply doing his job. As Michael walked through the hospital the next morning, his thoughts were still preoccupied with the events that had transpired. He couldn't help but wonder if he had done enough to de-escalate the situation with Officer Thompson. Did he respond in the right way? Should he have said something else or reacted differently? Michael was known for his calm demeanor under pressure, but even he could feel the weight of this situation. He knew the right thing to do was to focus on his patients and leave the investigation to the professionals, but the emotional toll was hard to ignore. That afternoon, while on his break, Michael received an unexpected phone call. It was from the Internal Affairs Department at the police station. His heart skipped a beat, unsure of what to expect. "Hello, Mr. Williams," the voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is Michael," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're conducting an investigation into the incident involving Officer Thompson. We'd like to speak with you further, if you're available," the officer said. Michael felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. The fact that the department was taking the matter seriously gave him some hope. But he knew that no matter how the investigation unfolded, the truth had to come out. "I'll be there," Michael said, determined. Later that afternoon, Michael arrived at the police station, where he was met by a team of officers from Internal Affairs. They were polite and professional, but there was a clear sense of tension in the air. Michael had never been involved in an investigation like this before, but he knew it was important to remain composed and stick to the facts. He was taken into a small room, where they began asking him questions about the incident. He explained what had happened in as much detail as he could remember, recounting the interaction with Officer Thompson and the events leading up to the altercation. As the interview continued, Michael could sense the seriousness of the situation. The officers asked him how he felt in the moments before and after the altercation. They were gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses, and reviewing the body camera footage. "We're taking this very seriously, Mr. Williams," one of the officers said. "We want to ensure that the appropriate actions are taken." Michael nodded, grateful that the department seemed committed to doing the right thing. The process was slow, but he understood it was necessary. He wasn't looking for revenge, he just wanted justice. As he left the police station, Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. Officer Thompson was a fellow human, and Michael knew that everyone made mistakes. However, the way the officer had treated him, and others in the past, couldn't be ignored. He hoped that the investigation would result in a fair and just outcome for everyone involved. As Michael returned to his duties at the hospital, he found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one person's actions. It was about ensuring that those who served and protected the community were held to a higher standard, no matter their personal struggles. He had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Now, more than ever, he was determined to stay true to those values. There was no turning back, but Michael knew that facing the consequences, both for himself and Officer Thompson, was an important step toward making things right. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Michael had the courage to keep moving forward. It wasn't just about justice for him. It was about creating a world where kindness and fairness prevailed, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Several weeks had passed since the incident involving Officer Thompson, and the investigation was still ongoing. Michael, though focused on his work at the hospital, had been anxiously awaiting an update. He had made peace with the fact that the situation would take time, but the uncertainty weighed on him. He found himself thinking about the officer often, wondering about his future and how he was coping with the aftermath of his actions. One sunny afternoon, as Michael was finishing a shift, he received a call from Detective Marcus Green. It was the call he had been waiting for. "Mr. Williams, I've got an update for you," Marcus said. "I just wanted to let you know that the investigation into Officer Thompson has concluded." Michael's heart skipped a beat as he listened carefully. "We've reviewed all the evidence, including the body camera footage, witness statements, and your report," Marcus continued. "The department has taken immediate action." A wave of relief washed over Michael, but he still had questions. What does that mean? What will happen next? Marcus paused for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. After reviewing everything, it was clear that Officer Thompson acted inappropriately that day. He has been placed on administrative leave, while the department determines further action. The chief has also promised that there will be training on de-escalation and bias for all officers. Michael wasn't sure how to feel. He was grateful that action had been taken, but part of him wanted to know if there would be more. Would Officer Thompson face consequences for what he had done, or was this just another lesson that wouldn't truly change anything? "It's a step in the right direction," Marcus said, sensing Michael's hesitation. "We're making sure that the department addresses the issue, and that's all we can do for now." Michael thanked Marcus and hung up the phone, taking a deep breath. He knew that the work wasn't over. This was only one part of the larger conversation about police accountability and the treatment of people of color. But he also knew that this incident, in some way, would push the department to think more critically about its actions. Over the next few days, Michael took time to reflect. He thought about how, as a paramedic, He had spent so much time helping others. But this situation, he realized, had been a reminder that sometimes help came in unexpected forms, not just through the work he did every day, but through speaking out and standing up for what was right. He had never been one to back down from standing up for others, and this incident only solidified that belief. One evening, as Michael was wrapping up his day, he walked past a police officer at the hospital. The officer nodded at him, offering a polite smile. Michael had never spoken to him before, but this time he felt a strange sense of understanding pass between them. It was as if they both recognized that the world needed to be better. They didn't have to say anything, but the shared understanding felt meaningful. Weeks later, Michael was called to the same scene where Officer Thompson had confronted him. This time, the police were there in full force, but there was a different energy in the air. As Michael tended to the patient, he could hear officers speaking in a more respectful tone, their body language open and non-threatening. That moment, small as it seemed, felt like progress. The changes weren't happening overnight, but they were happening, and that was enough for Michael. As for Officer Thompson, he never returned to the streets. The investigation had revealed that he needed more than just disciplinary action. He needed help, guidance, and a commitment to change. It was unclear what the future held for him, but Michael knew that this was a pivotal moment for both of them. The road ahead wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Michael had always known that it was the small, everyday choices that made a difference. Whether he was saving lives or speaking up when things went wrong, he remained determined to fight for justice. And while the battle was long, he now had hope that together, small steps could lead to significant change.